A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Gereva.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Schabbos hat es getan.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never
together with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is part 3 of our ongoing series about the secularization of the Jewish people in the modern era. I did miss last week entirely of doing an episode on Jewish History Soundbites. I was busy in New York. I was in the United States on a research project. It was actually quite successful, and I will hopefully be sharing the results of that research in the coming months, both in my writing with my friend and colleague, esteemed colleague, Davi Safir, in the Mishpacha magazine, as well as on this podcast, so stay tuned. So, in our first 2 parts of this series of the secularization of the Jewish people in the modern era, and with the tons and loads and excellent feedback that I received from many listeners, and please keep sending it. It's really, really quality stuff. So we discussed the causes of the secularization of the Jewish people in the modern era was more attributed to external forces of the modern era, not internal ones, that we discussed at length. That's the main thesis of this entire series. The second episode, we took it a bit further by discussing the establishment traditional religious response, and we made the fascinating discovery that orthodoxy is a modern movement, a product of modernity, a response to modernity, and that angered even more listeners, which is the goal. And an angered audience is an engaged audience. It's exciting to have a discussion, to have a give and take, and to have people who have opinions about things and intelligent opinions about things. That's the goal. So just to say for a second, a little editorial here. Most podcasts out there have this give and take between 2 hosts, or a host and his guest, his or her guests, or guests even, and therefore generates this discussion and this liveliness. And this podcast differs in that respect from most podcasts. We do not have a co-host or guests. But here we have a very engaged audience. And that provides the framework for the give and take. And you know, around the world, people are discussing what's happening on these podcasts and just talking about it with their friends and family and at their Shabbos table, and with me on emails and WhatsApp and texting, and it's wonderful. So you know, we're going to keep the conversation going, and it's really nice. So I want to elaborate on both points today in this third installment. I've gotten lots of feedback, as I said, a lot of flack, a lot of criticism and disagreement, all of it, without a single exception, in love and in respect, and I welcome it all. It was really, really nice. Brought up a lot of points, clarified a lot of points. So I really enjoying the diversity of opinions and insights and the passion displayed on this very relevant and important topic. So the goals of this episode today are to clarify a few of the elements of this discussion up until now about the actual process of secularization, which we haven't really talked about the mechanisms so much yet. We've really talked about what caused it and what the traditional response to it was. Now I want to make a broader point, which is crucial to this entire discussion. I commenced this entire series with a rather bold assertion, namely that until the dawn of the 18th century, the overwhelming majority of the Jewish people were religiously observant in the traditional sense. That's what I said. Now I want to clarify what I meant by that and also qualify it a bit, because I feel like I may have allowed myself to be misunderstood, especially since lots of the feedback surrounded this point, which does need elaboration, and I mentioned it too briefly. And I want to make several points in this regard regarding the above statement. Number one, did secularization really begin in the 18th century? Or did it begin much earlier? So the answer is that it really began much earlier. If we want to really start from the beginning of the story, and I think I did mention it in the first episode, but maybe I mentioned it too briefly, is that from the time of the expulsion from Spain and the Sephardic Jewish communities across the Spanish diaspora, there starts to be a slow but growing trend of acclimation to their surroundings, integration, and a laxity in traditional Jewish religious observance, which we would term today, in the modern era, secularization. Is it already the modern era in the 1600s or 1500s even? I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe it's the beginning of the modern era, the dawn of the modern era. All these things of modern eras are superficial divisions that historians make, but the people living at that time obviously did not make these distinctions. But we do see a trend of secularization beginning from that time, especially in the Sephardic diaspora communities of Amsterdam, London, Hamburg, and other places in Northern Europe. In other words, it's not just business or just this integration into the surrounding society or just this exposure to the Christian majority population. That's obviously the primary thing, but it's even more than that. There is already internal ideological, theological, philosophical, whatever you want to term it, underpinnings of the beginnings of secularization. People like Uriel de Costa, or more famously Benedict or Baruch Spinoza, who philosophically challenged some of the basic tenets of religious belief, of religious practice, and this creates the basis of early secularization, the ideological framework at least for early secularization. And others at the time, those are just two of the most famous ones, both of them in Amsterdam, both of them from Sephardic Spanish diaspora families, from the expellees from Spain. Not them, they themselves, their families, in other words, generations earlier. And there's early forms of secularism in those communities. Now, what's even more important is that, especially in those communities, in London, Amsterdam, Hamburg, and others similar to that, as opposed to other Spanish diaspora communities in the Ottoman Empire. But these in Northern Europe also have Ashkenazi communities eventually. So there's two communities living side by side, a Sephardic community and an Ashkenazi community. So these ideas of secularism influence the Ashkenazi communities as well. So there is early secularism, an early growing trend of secularism from the 1500s. So to say that in the 1700s, early 1700s, basically the entire Jewish people were religiously observant and then came the modern era, not entirely true, because from the 1500s it's already a growing trend from the Sephardic communities. And it's spreading and it's growing. So we would say that in the 1700s, the majority of the Jewish people were traditionally religiously observant, whatever that meant at that time, which we'll also get to. And there it started to grow even more as a result of the changes in the modern era in the 18th and even more so in the 19th century. So it just is a continually growing trend. And obviously, if we make it that early, then it even more weakens the thesis of Haskalas Berlin, or the Reform movement, or the Haskalah as being the impetus or the cause of secularization, because if it's already happening from the 1500s from Sephardic communities, then obviously has nothing to do with Reform or Mendelssohn or Haskalah or anything like that. The secularization is happening in the Jewish people, independent of all of that. The next point I want to make is another important. This I want to elaborate on for some time here. What does Jewish observance of halacha and religion even mean in the pre-modern era? How superficial or in depth, how meaningful is the religious observance of the Jewish people that we're even talking about? Was there widespread education and knowledge among the masses of the Jewish people in the pre-modern era? What did religious observance even look like? So again, we're not going to call it orthodoxy because orthodoxy is a product of the modern era. We're going to call it traditional religious observance in the pre-modern era. So what did that even mean? So in fact, there was widespread ignorance, and the religious observance that was observed by the overwhelming majority of the Jewish people was very superficial. Obviously, there were rabbis and scholars and the elite, the educated elite. But for the most part, I mean, the religious... First, let's talk about education. So obviously all women were not educated. That wasn't unique to the Jewish people. That was all over the world. In the pre-modern era, women did not get an education. Okay. So most of them were illiterate. They couldn't even read and write. Many men were. We always talk about how Jews were more literate than their non-Jewish neighbors in the pre-modern era. Well, it's all relative. In other words, if it was among the peasants of Europe in the pre-modern era, it was, I don't know, a very low percentage who were literate. So the Jews were a bit higher percentage. But it doesn't mean that everyone was literate. Large percentage. Again, exact numbers are hard to come by. But a large percentage of Jewish males, Jewish men, also were illiterate. And it's very simple. Why? Because people did not invest that much in education. They went to work at a very young age. They were, went into labor, into whatever business that they went into to help support their families at a relatively young age, and they did not spend that many years in cheder studying anything. And therefore there was not very widespread knowledge of Jewish observance, of halacha, of the tenets of the Jewish religion, of the belief system, of the Torah itself, of the requirements of halacha. And there's boatload of evidence to support that among the masses, the Jewish observance was very basic, very superficial. There was widespread ignorance, and you were part of the community. So you were part of the community, so you adapted to the community norms. You obviously went to shul on Shabbos, and you participated in the ceremonial rituals of the community and of the shul and of the Kahal and of the Yamim Tovim. You had a very basic knowledge of what it meant to be a Jew because you didn't have many options outside of the kehila, outside of the community. So that is something to bear in mind. Now, I want to expand on this idea. The Kahal, which was in the pre-modern era. We're going back to the pre-modern era now, before modernity. The pre-modern era, we'll say, up until the at least the 17th, 18th century, maybe even some earlier, some later, depending on each country, actually. But the Kahal, which was the autonomous governing system of each individual Jewish community, and very often was the case, especially in the Old Kingdom of Poland, was a national Kahal as well, the Vad Harbaratzis, but in other places as well. But for sure, in each individual community, there was the legal governing body called the Kahal, which was the community elite. But what I mean by legal was that the non-Jewish government recognized the autonomous power of the Kahal, and they backed it, they supported it. In other words, the Kahal made a law. Those were legally binding. The Kahal collected taxes. You were required by law to pay those taxes. The Kahal had their own judicial system, their own courts, which were recognized by law of the land. They could mete out punishments, and this was a legal governing body that was autonomous. In other words, the pre-modern era, when these empires and kings and whatever it was, the politics at that time, before the modern nation state, there was an idea that under the system of the way populations were divided at the time, the class system. So Jews were their own class. They were recognized as a merchant urban class. And since they were of a different religion, and religion was the only identity recognized in the pre-modern world, so therefore they have their own autonomy, as long as they pay the taxes to the government, and as long as they behave, and as long as they realize that they're subservient to the non-Jewish government. And of course, that was a risky existence, but we're not getting into the history of anti-Semitism over here. We're talking about the internal Jewish life over here inside the Kahal. And the Kahal was a recognized entity by that government that governed the internal Jewish religion and laws and legal system and everything else. Now, that was completely backed by the non-Jewish government. So the individual Jew in the pre-modern era was completely controlled by the Kahal and the Kahal's laws. And the non-Jewish governments of Europe in the pre-modern era only recognized religious communal affiliation. There was no such thing as individual, and there was no such thing as secular. It had to be communal, and it had to be religious. Very, very important. Meaning, the state did not recognize an individual citizen in the pre-modern era. Any citizen, not just Jews. Peasants weren't recognized as individuals either. They were recognized as a class. And the Jews, for our intents and purposes, were a community of Jews, the Jewish Kehillah, as far as the non-Jewish governments of Europe were concerned. So they do not recognize individuals. They recognize the community. And more importantly, they see the Jewish people and the Jewish community as a religious affiliation. Because everything in pre-modern Europe was religious. There was no such thing as secular, and there was no such thing as a non-religious affiliation. So the idea of being secular as an individual could not exist in pre-modern Europe. So one had to be, at least officially, at least legally, and at least superficially, at least nominally, and at least externally, an observant Jew in the pre-modern era. Again, with all those qualifications, he didn't have to be a learned Jew. He didn't have to be knowledgeable in Jewish practice. He can secretly, in the privacy of his own home, turn off the lights on Shabbos and no one would know the difference. By the way, if the Kahal caught him doing that, they probably would punish him. But if he didn't get caught, then that's his prerogative. But the only way out of the Jewish community in the pre-modern era was conversion to the church, to Christianity. There was no such thing as any other. So there's no idea of being an individual, not part of a community, and not part of a religious community. Being a secular individual simply did not and could not exist in the modern era. That is a really, really important point. So to say that the Jews of the pre-modern era were all religious, first of all, they didn't have a choice. They had to be part of the Kahal, whether they actually were religiously observant or not, beyond the superficial level, we have no idea. There's no way to quantify it. There's no way to get any statistical data on that. We have no idea. It could be most of them were not religious, or at least not religious in a real deep observant way. But they were under the control of the Kahal. The Kahal was backed by the non-Jewish government. The non-Jewish government did not recognize individuals, did not recognize secular. There was only religious communal affiliation. So you were a Jew if you didn't convert to the church. And if you were a Jew, you were an observant Jew because you were part of the Kahal. And the Kahal controlled your life. And they made sure everyone was observant, at least in a superficial, external way. Right? Now, again, we go even further back. The idea that there's such a thing called a trend of assimilation of mass populations throughout Jewish history always existed. If we go all the way back to the ancient world, during the second Beis HaMikdash, there was Hellenism, there was the Sadducees, the Tzaddukim, which was not really secularization, it was just a different type of religion. And you go through Jewish history, there's many, many examples of mass assimilation, and But I want to focus on European Jewry in the pre-modern era, where there was this idea of the Kahal controlling Jewish life, and it was legally autonomous. They had their own Batei Din, which were a judicial system recognized by the government, that they can have their own laws, and anyone who does not observe the laws of the Bezdin of the Kahal can be punished, can be fined, can be put in prison. They had full legal jurisdiction over the individuals of the Jewish community. Now, what happens in the modern era? The main thing is political changes, the rise of the nation state, and eventually citizenship, which means that the individual is recognized as an entity toward the country. He has to pay his own personal taxes, not that the Jewish community owes taxes to the government. Yankel owes taxes to the government based upon, let's say, his income or based on his participation in the economy. Now, this political change and this reality ultimately paves the way for secularization among all of Europe, Christian Europe too, but we're now focusing on the Jewish community. This weakens the autonomy of the Kahal because the governments, the non-Jewish Christian governments of Europe, no longer recognize the jurisdiction of the Kahal. It lessens the Kahal's legislative and, more importantly, judicial jurisdiction over members of the Jewish community. That's the modern era. And therefore, it paves the way for secularization. Secularization as a movement, as a trend, as something that could have that affected large swaths of the Jewish population could not have existed altogether in the pre-modern era. It's impossible because of what I just described. The difference between the pre-modern era and the modern era, as far as religious observance and secularization is concerned, is that the modern era, because of its political changes and the way the nation state rises and the way it looks like at citizenship and the way it breaks down these early autonomous communal structures called the Kahal and sees individual citizens and creates this space of non-religious affiliation. It's no longer seen as a religious affiliation. It's no longer seen as a communal affiliation. It's an individual affiliation. And the individual is judged not based on their religious affiliation, but rather on their contribution to the country's economy and well-being. That's what a citizen of the country. And that's the only judgment of the individual citizen in the modern era, not their religious affiliation. And therefore, that creates a new space called secularism, secularization. Now, what is the defense of religion in the modern era? They create the voluntary kahal, the voluntary kihila. You choose to be part of the Orthodox community. You choose your association with religion, with religious observance as your identity by choice, not because you're born into it and you're forced in it because of the kahal and because you don't want to get punished in front of the shul courtyard by getting, cherem or something like that. The kahal no longer has power of cherem, no longer has this legislative and judicial power to punish and to prison and to cherem and to tax and to all that it had in the pre-modern era when it was autonomous. So what creates the space for religious observance in the modern era? Completely voluntary. There's this element of association with religion and community. I'm part of the religious community. My identity is an Orthodox Jew. My identity is with religion in the modern era. And therefore, that's by choice. And therefore, that creates a strong Orthodox community. The orthodoxy as the modern movement, like we were describing in last episode, is that it's voluntary. It's not forced upon it by the Kahal. It's that I choose not to be secular. I choose to define myself with orthodoxy. I choose to associate with this community and this educational system and to educate my children in this specific way. By the way, that continues until this very day. Till this very day, all the nation states of the world, to the best of my knowledge, do not recognize the autonomous judicial and legislative legality of the Kahal, and they recognize citizenship, individuals, not communal religious affiliation, as in the pre-modern era, and therefore, anyone who does associate with religion today, it's voluntary, and it's a voluntary association. It's a sense of pride, it's a sense of identity, very important, and that creates not just a defensive mechanism, but it's also a sense of pride, cohesion, association, community, all voluntary, not forced, not the very nature of things like it was in the pre-modern era. And therefore it creates a strong orthodoxy. And that is why orthodoxy, another reason why orthodoxy is a product of the modern era. It has to be, because without the automatic identity of being part of the Kahal, like in the pre-modern era, and kind of like being forced into it, and it's very superficial and external, and it's just the reality because of who's converting to Christianity. There were people who did, but not many in the pre-modern era. And obviously, if you convert to Christianity, you left the Kahal, and you're now a new religious identity, new community. But we're talking about the overwhelming majority who did not convert to Christianity in the pre-modern era, and therefore they were just automatically part of the Kahal. But in the modern era, not the postmodern is something else, we'll say that for another time, but in the modern era, the association is voluntary. And this association and pride and identity with religion, with orthodoxy and community and education is a defensive mechanism. I'm not secular. I don't want my kids to be secular. I don't want them to be this. I want them to be orthodox. And this, therefore, a strong sense of identity creates a strong orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is a product of the modern era. And this relates to another point. And this is a big, something that we discuss and we're educated in throughout our lives. How did we survive the exile with a strong Jewish identity? Did we survive the exile 2,000 years into the diaspora with a strong Jewish identity despite non-Jewish oppression, or because of the non-Jewish external forces, the non-Jewish governments, as a result of the non-Jewish surroundings? The attitude of Christian Europe to the Jewish population of Europe from the Middle Ages until modern times was to, unlike what they did, the spread of Christianity in Europe was taking pagan tribes and forcibly converting them to Christianity over about 1,000 years. That's a story of the Christianization of Europe from the time of the Roman Empire until the last tribes of Europe converted to Christianity in the early 13th, maybe even 14th century, I don't remember. So that's a whole story of how Europe became Christian. Used to be pagan, and then it became Christian. There was one population in the entire Europe that the church did not forcibly convert to Christianity. That was the Jewish minority. The Jewish minority was the only religious minority in the Middle Ages in Europe. There were no other minorities. Every other minority was forcibly converted to Christianity. Now, sometimes Jews were forcibly converted to Christianity too. That's a different story. When we get into the Middle Ages one day, we'll talk more about that. But the attitude overall of Christian Europe was to not always forcibly convert the Jewish population of Europe, and they allowed them to keep this communal autonomous structure, and that allowed this space for Jewish observance to be kept at the communal level. So the Jewish religion, the Jewish community with Jewish identity survived the exile, not despite the non-Jews, but because of the non-Jews. Did we survive despite the Goyim, or did we survive because of the Goyim? We survived because of them. They kept us separate, and they kept the Jewish autonomous structure. They legally backed the Kahal. They kept it strong. They gave them legal power. They gave them judicial power. And at least at the communal level, Jewish observance was kept. Now that collapses in the modern era. And the result is this religious commitment, this orthodoxy, which is this defensive minority. Defensive because it's against this onslaught of secularism, and it's a minority because the majority became secular. But it's stronger and more confident in its identity, and it's also more educated. It's the orthodoxy in already the 19th century, and for sure in the 20th and 21st century, is much more educated among its ranks than Jewish observance, traditional Jewish observance in the pre-modern era, because that's part of the defense mechanism. We need to have an educated, because it's voluntary, because it's by association, because it's a pride and identity, which none of that existed in the modern era. It just was. You were part of the Kahal. You didn't have any other choice. You just were. You existed as part of the Jewish Kahal, Kehila. So there was no education, or very little of it. And that ultimately is the successful Orthodox response in the modern era. And that is a product of modernity, and orthodoxy is a modern movement. I want to summarize another related point, which I mentioned briefly last episode. History, unfortunately, is somewhat deterministic. That's my view anyway. It's not an absolute view. There's a difference of opinion about this, but that happens to be my view. And this is open to discussion if others have a different view, that history is not deterministic. But to me, it's clear that these huge factors of political change in the modern era, all these expressions of modernity, economic change, emancipation, immigration, wars, revolutions, urbanization, the rise of the nation state, etc., dwarf anything a small minority could hope to influence. It's just futile. The modern era it's deterministic. Things happen. The society is changing. The world is changing. A critical mass of people, Jewish people in this instance, begin to secularize. The secularization movement is a silent movement. It happens. It just takes place over time. There's no leadership. There's no ideology. There's no systemic change. This movement of secularization does not have institutions. They don't have speeches. They don't have publications. They don't have a platform. They just move towards secularization. All these internal Jewish movements of reform and haskalah are very different. Very, very different. They're probably a response to the modern era. They're probably a response to secularization, or at least a response to assimilation, to stem the tide of assimilation. But the secularization is just happening. It's not an ideology. It's deterministic. It's just a reality of the integration of the modern era. There's integration, there's acculturation, so there's going to be secularization and ultimately assimilation. That's just what happens. These larger external factors. It's very similar, by the way, to immigration in that regard. Immigration, when 3.5 million Jews leave Eastern Europe between the 1870s and the 1920s, which is one of the largest shifts of humanity in history, in human history. So what happens? There's an ideology of immigration. There's a leadership of immigration. There's a platform. There's an institutions that are constructed to promote immigration. There were some publications, but those had very little influence. It just happens. It's the people who create history. It's society who creates history. It's economic factors and technology changes that create history, and wider, broader changes that create history. And it comes up from the grassroots. It's a grassroots movement. It's not from the leadership top down. It is just happening. And that's the same thing with secularization. There are these changes which lead to integration. Jews start to integrate into society. There's an acculturation to society, which leads to a laxity of Jewish observance and ultimately secularization. Now, what happens after that is a reaction. Religious reaction, the rabbinical reaction, the Kahal, the old leadership, the Orthodox rabbis and other leadership is reacting to this grassroots bottom-up phenomena. It's inherently, at this point, the reaction of the rabbinical establishment is inherently a defensive posture. And much of it is quite abstract. It makes perfect sense that internal modern Jewish movements would be labeled the enemy, and the reaction is primarily focused towards them, because the reaction to the modern world is abstract. It's very broad. It's very gradual. It's very this integration. And who's the enemy? Who are we fighting against? When the rabbinical establishment, the religious establishment, the Kahal, the Orthodox rabbis and leaders, when they're reacting to this grassroots phenomenon, how are they supposed to finger the enemy? How are you supposed to point out what you're opposed to? How are you supposed to strengthen religion when the modern era, with all its broad changes, is so abstract? So it makes perfect sense that they found something more concrete. These internal modern Jewish movements, such as Reform, such as Haskalah, such as the Neolog in Hungary, such as other Jewish movements, they are labeled the enemy, and the reaction, the Orthodox reaction, is primarily focused towards them because that's something concrete. This publication is bad. This idea of Jewish education is bad. This change in halacha is bad. This type of synagogue is bad, and we are against that, and we are opposed to that. Then you rally the troops around that. Now, I'm just going to give a few more examples because just really, really bring out some of these points. One of many examples. The Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1868, Emperor Franz Joseph, the Habsburg Empire, 1868 passes a legislation from Vienna across the entire empire of emancipation. All citizens in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, irrespective of ethnicity or religion, not sure about gender, but definitely of ethnicity and religion, are all equal citizens of the empire. Okay? So the Jews receive emancipation. They're now equal citizens, even though they're Jews. And for 1,000 years they had been discriminated against. Now they're equal citizens. 1 year later, 1869, there's another law passed in Vienna across the whole empire, a compulsory education law, meaning everyone has to go to public school or a state-recognized private school. So there's compulsory education. So in two fell sweeps, legislation of the parliament in Vienna in 2 years, two laws, one of emancipation, one of compulsory education, did more to cause secularization to the Jews of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Those two laws did more to cause secularization than 1,000 reform neolog temples or Haskalah books or Haskalah rabbis or progressive rabbis could ever accomplish. It's so obvious and apparent that I don't see any reason to elaborate on this further. And I'll bring another example. By far, the greatest mass secularization in modern Jewish history was over the course of the Great Immigration to the United States between 1875 and 1924. Over 2.5 million Jews immigrated to the United States during this time. Over 3.5 million emigrated from Eastern Europe, but about 2.5 million made it to the United States. If we remove a minority from that 2.5 million who were already secularized prior to immigration, and if we remove another even smaller minority who steadfastly remained religiously observant even following their immigration to the United States, we're still left with millions of Jews who secularized within a generation of their arrival in the United States. What happened? How did millions of Jewish immigrants who were religious back in Europe secularize within a generation or two at max within their arrival to the United States? How? How did they secularize? Was it because of Haskalah? Was it because of reform? Give me a break. It was 100% due to factors of the immigration itself. Number one, the very act of immigration and uprooting from a familiar milieu. Number two, the ultra-urbanization that they experienced when they arrived in places like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia. Number three, a lack of a strong communal infrastructure in their new country. Number four, lack of educational infrastructure and the embracing of the immigrant generation of the American public school system and the Americanization that it provided. Number five, the need to work on Shabbos because there was no 2-day weekend at that time. So one simple act, immigration to a new country, an external symptom of the modern era because immigration was a product of the modern era. That was the result of the modern era, the result of economic changes, the result of expectations of emancipation in Tsarist Russia that were not realized, an expectation of the disappearance of anti-Semitism in the rest of Europe that was not realized, economic changes, technological changes. That's what all led to immigration. And one simple act of immigration to a new country did much, much more to secularize a sizable Jewish population of millions of Jews in a relatively rapid fashion in 40, 50 years, much more than a century of Haskalah and reform and all that. So again, an example from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, we had compulsory public education plus emancipation did a lot more to secularize Jews in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which includes Galicia, by the way, than anything the reform in Haskalah in that empire could have possibly dreamed of or done. And then the immigration to the United States secularized millions of Jews without any, literally no impact of reform and Haskalah, just the act of immigration itself. And I'll give you another example from Germany, which is supposedly the cradle of Haskalah and reform and the cradle of secularization. Secularization in the 18th century and earlier, we mentioned that it starts earlier in other places as well, it starts without a song and a dance, without a proclamation, without a movement, without an ideology, long before Haskalah and reform or anything else in Central Europe, such as Germany, as well as in other areas of Western Europe, through Jewish merchants, not ideologues, not thinkers, not philosophers, not progressive rabbis. Jewish merchants. Jewish merchants are more exposed to surrounding society, so they're more exposed to the changes in the world. Jewish doctors, who are often the only academics in the Jewish community, are very often the ones who are the most integrated. They're the local physician, and they're the only ones who had a college education. So the universities in Italy and Germany, who were the only ones who accepted Jews at the time. How about the court Jews in Germany? The court Jews in Germany were just wanted to lead a more frivolous lifestyle. They were wealthy. They were connected to the German aristocracy, to the nobility. Sometimes they themselves got titles because of their wealth and their banking. And they wanted to integrate, and their kids were exposed to German literature and to German children from other aristocratic homes. And they wanted to lead a more pleasure lifestyle. And that leads to laxity in Jewish observance. No ideology unless pleasure and materialism is an ideology. Maybe it is. But it's definitely not an internal ideology of Haskalah reform. It's an ideology of integration and assimilation and wanting to move up the socioeconomic scale. In other words, it's external forces. And they start integrating into their surrounding culture and norms. So we mentioned three types of Jews. Merchants, doctors, and court Jews, wealthy, the elite. They are the ones who start secularization, and they are not, this obviously leads to laxity in traditional Jewish observance, and it's the beginning of secularization, and they are not Reform and Haskalah. In fact, Reform and Haskalah were coming to oppose this movement. They said, whoa, look at these court Jews and these Jewish merchants. They're dropping their Jewish identity. They're secularizing and assimilating, and there's going to be intermarriage, and there's going to be a disappearance of Jewish identity. Let's adapt Judaism to the modern world and therefore make it compatible. And these children of these court Jews won't just go on dates with non-Jews. They'll still want to remain within the Jewish community. Now, obviously, we can provide another 100 examples. I'm pretty convinced of this thesis, but I welcome dissenting views, and I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you. So you can email me at yehuda@yehudigeber.com. We'll speak in the next couple of episodes more about secularization and the role of internal Jewish movements in the modern era. We'll probably have an episode dedicated to answering all the feedback on this series. This is Yehudi Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudigeber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.